I, as a writer and an art historian, will talk a little bit about my own experience as a Romanian living in Paris for quite a long time. And as Radu mentioned, I was a visiting professor there, and then I was the director of the Cultural Institute, Romanian Cultural Institute there. And my experience was very specific in a certain way. I thought I was an European when I arrived there. I was convinced that I was imbued with European values, that I was educated with the European literature. I spoke English and French, so I had many tools to be considered a European. At that time, Romania was not yet a member of the EU. And nevertheless, I realized little by little that I was not, or I was not perceived as a real European, because I was coming from Eastern Europe, which is something different from Europe and from the Western Europe. And this was a terrible discovery, which was painful and interesting at the same time. I remember when I read Milan Kundera's famous essay, An Occident a Kidnapped West, that he published in the 80s, and which provoked a huge amount of discussions, even in the socialist European countries. Because there he sustained that countries from Central and Eastern Europe considered themselves European, while the Occident, the West, had forgotten them, because they didn't consider them as really European. And that there was this contradiction, this tension between the old image of Central Eastern Europeans, with their literature, as Radu mentioned, and the external perception. And that in this respect, the Central Eastern Europeans felt themselves forgotten by the West. So the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire could kidnap them. And this was the tragedy of Eastern Europe. And this formula, tragedy of Eastern Europe, made a fortune in our cultures from this part of Europe. And this continued even after 1989 and 1990, when the communist regimes fell down in all these countries. And this problem of Eastern Europe is, in my view, has been a long problem, and a topic that produced a lot of questioning and problematization. And Eastern Europe is a territory which is difficult to define, because it is between the West and between the East, which is Russia, which is the Slavic world, so to say. And this region was called in different ways: Middle Europe, the Third Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Oriental Europe, and so on and so forth. Very many denominations in regard with the political or geopolitical situation of the region. So this region had so many problems to define itself, in fact. And we have so many definitions of Eastern Europe, from a historical or geopolitical respect, from a religious point of view, from a cultural perspective, and so on and so forth. And even if after 1890 the situation has begun to change in all these countries, even if starting with 2004 a number of countries of this region became members of the EU, and then in 2007 Romania and Bulgaria became also members, and so on. I think this difference is still being perceived, can still be perceived between the two parts of Europe, so to say, the western part and the eastern part. And this difference comes from, obviously, from the history of this region, and from the way this region has modernized itself, because Eastern Europe fell, so to say, under the influence of the Western modernizing rule or time, starting with the 19th century. But it was like an artificial imposing of modernizing over a population that were not at all prepared for this huge change. Only the elite class of these countries wanted so much to become European, to become modern, to become Western, and forced these societies to enter modernism and modernity. And this created many tensions between the levels, the layers of the society. For example, in Romania you have, even now, you have an archaic rural level which contains a majority part of the population. Even now, 40% of the Romanian population belongs to this level. Then you have the Byzantine, post-Byzantine religious level which lasted during the feudal period. And then you have the modern level which started with the 19th century, and now we have also the postmodern level which started from the 90s. And all these levels are still vivid. They are still vivid, they are still productive. They have their own values, principles, products, and so on. And moreover, now Romania has to harmonize all these levels, but also the level of the communist period, which was also a civilization in itself. And we cannot throw it down to the, I don't know, from the constitution of the Romanian society and culture. So these are specificities which cannot be forgotten, and which give a certain taste and a certain way of being for the populations of these regions. Of course, there are differences between Romania and Czech Republic or Poland, Hungary, and so on and so forth, but there are also common denominators which make that we can understand a little bit better our colleagues from Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and so on, because we have something in common. And I think that these specificities were not taken into account always by the European community and by the European structures and institutions and so on. And probably it would have been difficult to take into account all these differences and specificities. But this brought a sort of complex of inferiority to these peoples, which are not so prepared, so well educated to accepting immediately democracy, pluralism, privatization, and all the phenomena that started in the 90s. Nevertheless, these countries become more and more integrated into the European melting pot. We have to acknowledge this. And the interest of the West for this region has evolved during the last 30 years, 19th, 20th, 2000s and 2010s. I mean, I can tell you that as an art historian, I saw lots of exhibitions, huge cultural events, festivals that tried to synthesize the spirit of this region during this period. And at the beginning it was more like Central Europe because of the Visegrad group, and then it was Central and Eastern Europe which was in the focus of these cultural international events, and then it was Eastern Europe, and then it was Southeastern Europe, and then it was Balkans, and then it was the Western Balkans. Now it's not. And in the last years, this interest for this region, in my view, vanished. I mean, it was more and more discreet because these countries are more and more integrated into the European Union, so they are not so interesting anymore. But nowadays we have the Ukrainian war, and suddenly Eastern Europe has become a new topic, a geopolitical topic, which is interesting because it's so hard to deal with. And this can offer a chance. This is my last idea. This can offer a chance to this region to become more vivid, more visible, more active, involved in the European politics. And look at how Poland is nowadays. It's so strong, so decisive in its attitudes and decisions. Ukraine is such a huge surprise, and it is also Eastern Europe. We have to acknowledge that Ukraine is a part of Eastern Europe, of this middle region which constitutes our region. And even Romania has a chance now to become more involved in the high political struggle. And I would like very much that Romania assume a more active role in this process. Thank you.
I can promise you this is not your last idea. I'm going to try to build a common question for both of you from what I've understood from your interventions, and I was thinking maybe then after you answer to open the floor towards the audience. I'm sure there must be questions, reactions, and so on. So Magda, you talked about something which could be maybe summarized as the unification of Europe. It's like there are two Europes, the Western and the Eastern one, and they need to unify their memories, the memories of their historical traumas and of their specificities and so on. And Louis spoke about how we should define our attitude towards the radical other. So in order to keep maybe civil contracts with, maybe even with an aggressor, but without becoming paranoid and without considering everybody outside Europe a threat, if I summarize it correctly. So I think these two answers, when you spoke, I think that these answers can be unified, and led me to another question. When you were both talking, there came into my mind this book, famous book I think, of contemporary French philosopher Rémi Brague, Europe, la voie romaine. It's a book from the late 90s, Europe, the Roman Path, where he asked himself what Europe is, if there is some trait, some fundamental trait which we could call Europe. And he came to this answer that the fundamental European characteristic is secondarity, which sounds complicated maybe, but it's something very simple. It's, Braque says, it's looking outside oneself, seeing something fundamentally alien, strange, something which is not your authority, so to say, internalize it, metabolize it, and transform it into identity. This is what secondarity is, Rémi Braque. And he gives historical examples, famous historical examples. The Romans taking the Greek authority and transforming it into identity. They start measuring their values according to the Greek ones, and so on. Okay? Europe taking Christianity, which is born at the limits of the geographical Europe, in non-European languages, and transforming Christianity into its backbone for 16th, 17th centuries. Okay? And so on. This is what secondarity is. So this is important because it seems to me that it's if secondarity is a European trait, if Rémi Braque is right, then we have to not lose it, so to say. To be able to look at the other, even if it's a radical alien to us, a radical authority, but to be able to internalize and metabolize it and transform it into parts of our identity. This is, I think, what we may risk losing if we close within Europe as within a citadel, which is under threat now, it's true, but if we preserve this mechanism, this psychological mechanism of the besieged citadel forever, maybe Europe stops being Europe. And it's also within Europe. This is in the attitude outside Europe, what Luis was saying. What Magda was speaking about was the attitude within Europe, inside Europe. It's like treating the Eastern European as something other than European, and vice versa. And even the concept of Eastern European is unfair, because if we take, for example, only the Danube, which unifies the eastern part of the continent, it travels through, I don't know, 12 countries, maybe more. Even in the Roman Empire, it unified, I think, 9 kingdoms, from Bavaria, Stygia to Pannonia, Mercia, Pontus, Euxines, and so on. So, and now it's territories which are Catholic, which are Protestant, which are Orthodox, which are Islamic, some of them. And it's very different territories, and we label them Eastern Europe as the Eastern European identity, even though it's something very variegated and diverse. And so this danger is also inside Europe, of not being able to see the authorities of the other, the specificities of the other. And maybe if we lose this mechanism, this ability to take authority and transform it into identity, maybe we risk stopping being European, if I understood correctly what you said. I'm not sure I answered the question.
I think that's a fantastic reflection, Radu. I very much agree with you. I remember I read Brad's book in my Master in European Studies in Poland, and I think you're making a very interesting reading there, because actually alterity, incorporating alterity and this sort of cosmopolitan view, I think is very, I would say it's essential for what I meant of this narrative openness to the world. In the sense, there's a very beautiful book by Salvador Madariaga, one of the, he was president of the cultural committee of the Council of Europe in the big conference in 1958. And he has a book called, well, I wouldn't translate that in English or around the world, but basically he starts saying Europe will exist culturally when Spaniards are able to say or Krakow, and when Romanians are able to say or Bruges, that you actually identify other parts of Europe as part of your own culture. And I think if that's true, I think that needs to shape our attitude as Europeans as well. And I don't know if we need to say or Beijing or Johannesburg, but really I think as Europeans we need to look beyond our own territories, our own identity, to really shape this new relation to the world. And this is interesting for Elena, because our students, we have had a deliberative forum with students from 3 universities during the entire year, and one of the things that always comes back with students when they want to show pro-Europeanness is we need to create a course on European Union at school. I always get very tired of this day. I think it's very lazy. I always, when I discuss with students, I told them, I think what we need is a European education, not exactly a course on Europe. Basically, I think we need a cosmopolitan education. So I think that this is what we need in terms of building this Europe, right? Is looking at the other as something that was part of yourself.
There is this Spanish politician, you must know him, Javier, who functioned as a vice president of the European Parliament. And when we had these protests in Romania in 2018, we were invited to Brussels, to the European Parliament, to present our discontents with the Romanian government. And we had a talk there outside the European Parliament with Javier and with this lady. She runs the Green Party in Germany. I can't remember her name right now, but it started raining, like, and it was a very cold rain, March in Brussels, you can imagine. And we had no umbrellas and so on, and everybody stayed. And it was so cold and freezing. We were talking, it was live on Facebook and so on. And I asked Javier Nart, you can check, the question is there in the Facebook panel. And I asked him, so, Mr. Nart, why do you, a Spanish politician, stay in a freezing rain to discuss about the rule of law in Romania, where you have no constituents? And he said, and this is almost exactly your words, Luis. He said, because Andalusia is Romania and Moldavia is Spain. This is what Europe means. It's his exact words, and I think it's, so he was a European, able to stay, to withhold the freezing rain for the rule of law in some part of Europe. Magda.
Yeah, this is a beautiful idea and I totally agree with it. What you said about the Libra, I want to tell you that this is a common idea in the French milieu, that the European spirit means to accept criticism and self-criticism and to transform it into a form of evolution, of battling to the things. And I remember that even Susan Sontag in the 90s came to Paris to give a lecture at the university where I was, and she said the same thing, and she was so proud to say it because, and she was an American, of course, because this seemed to her the strength, the force, the fundamental force of the European spirit, to accept, to accumulate from other cultures and to transform them into its own value and to accept self-criticism, which is the most important thing. And she underlined that Europe is the only culture that assumed this criticism, self-criticism, in such a vivid way. And this is true and obvious, but of course there must be some limits in everything. I mean, accepting too many influences, you have to digest them and to transform them into your own identity, little by little or so on. So politics is a very subtle game to play and to sustain, to keep a balance between outputs and inputs in such a way that you do not destroy the European spirit. And what is European spirit? It's a huge question, but everybody must know a little bit what the European spirit is. We recently talked about this, probably here. And it is also related to the idea of a soul for Europe, as you mentioned. And I remember Jacques Delors, who was a French politician and who was president of the European Commission in the 80s. He said that Europe needs a soul. Europe needs a soul. And he had in mind the same idea that it is not enough to have good institutions, to have extremely developed legislation, to have financial programs and so on and so forth, which are very useful, of course, but it's not enough to create a unity, a European unity, as you mentioned. And we need something more, and this something more, it's very difficult to define, but it means, first of all, culture. It means to have cultural exchanges, to have translation, because translation is the real language of Europe, as Umberto Eco said, and to have this kind of mixages, cultural mixages between regions and populations. And I love very much this idea to be I don't know, Toscana and Moldavia, my Moldavia and Toscana, this kind of, and what is positive is that, for example, in Romania, recently a Euronews TV channel in Romanian started, only a few weeks ago, and it's in Romanian. So this is very important because I used to look at the Euronews in English because it was the only one. And now we have this in Romanian. Probably it will exist also in other languages, and this will create the necessary mass media instrument to unify and to homogenize more our people.
Can I just one of this thing that, because I think the Roman past is also an example of narratives in conflict, right? Because we have this Rome that stopped conquering the world and looked inside, and which had philosophers and emperors like Marcus Aurelius and so on, who was able to incorporate the new migrants and have actually the new migrants be the new generals, and actually the Roman army was so full of gods and hands and whatever it is. But you also had the ones that wanted to go back to the past, right, and make Rome great again. Now, why say that? Because, well, Western Europeans are not the only ones thinking that we descend directly from Romans. You will know that since the 16th century, every Muscovian ruler has seen himself as the third Rome, and that's in the famous movie Ivan the Terrible. There will be no fourth. Right? So this is a bit of the concern, right? Now is Mr. Putin seeing himself as Justinian, trying to regain the lost territories at the time of crisis? Now that's a bit of too much speculation, but this reclaiming this Roman identity and different versions of the Roman identity, I think is also a very good example of how narratives shape these international politics.
True. So now, probably there are questions or interventions from the audience.
I completely agree that translating media.
Sorry, can you present yourself? So
Magda Cîrneci, a student at FSC, GSC is a journalism and media-based university. And I completely agree that translating the language to every country or to as many countries as possible is helping. It's certainly helping because we cannot assume that everybody knows the universal language. So with this we can reach more people and we can give more awareness about being European and what is happening. That's truly important for us Europeans. I think this helps.
Yeah, I think translation is besides what Eco famously said, translation is also the language of liberty, of freedom. And I found a sort of ironic, sarcastic compliment, or even unintentional compliment to the idea of translation and translator, when I read in Burhan Sönmez, the Turkish prose writer who runs PEN International. He says that in contemporary Turkish prisons, the tortionaries call the clubs they are beating the prisoners with translators, which is of course an unintentional compliment. They know what the real enemy is. It's the translator, the free mind who travels between cultures and cannot be stopped. So
that's a very interesting view. I don't know, maybe some control for some countries on how you translate things and how you send the information.
Is this a question for Magda and Luis?
No, it's a comment.
Ah, okay, sorry.
That's a comment, I apologize. Yeah, maybe a little bit of control when it comes to sending information to certain countries in order to not find any misunderstandings would be ideal.
If I may, because the conference is entitled Found in Translation. So, this is one of the things we wrote into the project, and what we meant is that, of course, linguistic translation is essential. I think what you described rather is very beautiful, this language of liberty. But what we argue as well is that we need a sort of political translation, that basically, if Europe is to work, we cannot expect to have a single European public consuming all the time the same news, having a single interpretation of facts. And not even in such an extraordinary context as war in Ukraine, we are going to have that. I mean, of course, war in Ukraine cannot mean the same thing for someone living on the Polish border, someone living in Algeciras in the Gibraltar Strait in Spain. I mean, it's impossible. What we need is to have mediators, cultural, political, all kinds of mediators that are able to decode the messages coming from European institutions, coming from all the European countries, and tell us why this is relevant for you. There's one very obvious reason that applies in terms of the alternative. You were saying why we are concerned about the war in Ukraine, because it could be us. I mean, of course, we are very easily transported into the shoes of someone living in Kharkiv. But at the same time, we need to also be convinced of why this is concerning for us, not only on the emotional level, but also on the political, economic, social, and cultural ways. So in the sense, what I think what Europe needs is really to have this network of cultural and political translators and mediators able to sort of decode the messages coming from Brussels.